Hey, what's up, guys? It's Rico here, CEO of Source for Asia, host of the Main Channel podcast, and the host of the Source for Asia YouTube channel, of course, back with another one. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about how to prepare for a crowdfunding campaign from a sourcing and manufacturing perspective.
I notice when I walk outside, I hope this pays off. One day I chose it, one day, someday I hope it. Went in the big labels and saw plaques on walls, but I didn't post it. Didn't want to gas or boast it, that's not one of the things I'm made of. But one day will it pay off? Mum says I got to do music, and Dad says to not quit my day job. It's a hard one still, it's not fake, the bars are real. Sometimes I can rely on people's advice, I can't rely on pills. I notice now, things keep falling down. When they fall, I still build them up. Hard when you don't know how. Something's changed, yeah, you know the deal. At the end of the day, I'm over that one still. Over that one. When I play shows, I'm sober at none. Not from London, no the accent. Not just talking, loads of action. Is this music or is it acting? One step forward, then go backwards. Think it makes me over anxious. Things can change, it's known to happen. I feel like I don't need people's help. And then when I think about it, I'm proud I could have been someone.
It's super common that when people launch crowdfunding campaigns, when we're talking about physical products, they sort of forget how important it is to be prepared from a manufacturing standpoint, because they're so focused on creating this cool campaign and trying to get people on board and try to get as much backers as possible. And of course, that's like the whole point of the campaign is, you want to raise money. But at the end of the day, a product has to be produced from the money that you make. So if you're not prepared from a sourcing manufacturing side of things, your business could fail before it even starts. Some notable examples are Coolest Cooler, which I think raised over $20 million. I think it was the largest crowdfunding campaign ever, or at least Kickstarter ever at the time. It was like 4 or 5 years ago. Some of the points that I'm going to mention, there's 4 points specifically, are some of the mistakes that these guys made. But despite them raising so much money, they weren't prepared from a manufacturing standpoint. And I think to this day, 4 years later, I think they still haven't fulfilled most of their backers. So yeah, I mean, it can be a gift and a curse. Like if you don't prepare manufacturing from a manufacturing standpoint and you raise a shit ton of money, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to end up with a successful business. So that being said, the 4 main points I want to make are people tend to focus on marketing and not the sourcing. They tend to overcomplicate their first product. They don't allocate enough time for the manufacturing process and take into consideration all the sort of bumps and ups and downs that go through the process of actually making a product for the first time. And because of poor planning, they tend to not have enough of a budget for their manufacturing or sort of the ancillary services that are involved in producing a product. All right, so point number 1, focusing on marketing and not sourcing. So, I mean, it's a natural thing. A crowdfunding campaign is essentially a whole marketing campaign. But the thing is, before you even launch your campaign, and you need to, even before you finalize your design of your product, you need to know if this is a product that can actually be produced. So you have to be communicating and researching suppliers very early on in the design process. Before you even think about launching a campaign, you should be, you have your design, you have your product, you have your initial, let's say, drawing on a piece of paper, then it goes to 2D, then 3D CAD. You should be contacting and talking to suppliers during that CAD process, because it's one thing to hire a designer who can make a beautiful design of a product. It's another thing to design for manufacturing. Just because something has been produced by an engineer doesn't mean that the actual factories can make it. And it's important to get factories involved early on in the process. On top of that, during that process of going through the design for manufacturing, you also need to be creating, or at least attempting to create, reliable, functioning prototypes. So a lot of times people launch crowdfunding campaigns just off of a 3D drawing or a non-functional prototype. But that's a recipe for disaster, because if you launch your campaign and you're promising that it's going to take, the delivery will be in 5 months, and you haven't even made a functioning prototype, there's no way that that's an accurate production date, unless the product is super simple and doesn't involve too much more work. Like, you have to try to make a functioning prototype. Like, the functioning prototype is going to help your factory understand how difficult or how easy it is to make this product, and also the costs involved. That's going to give them a better and more accurate idea of how long it's going to take to produce, what the materials are involved. Like a lot of times, even something as simple as like what one of our clients launched a campaign and it was yoga shorts. Something as simple as just getting the right materials. The materials that they were using are normal, but the blend was unusual for a lot of factories. So even just understanding that early on, knowing that it might take a while for factories to source the materials, that stuff is important. You only learn that when you start going through the actual prototype phase. So I think it's extremely important to get that kind of stuff done. For a factory in the process of creating a prototype, they know what the production costs are also going to be, and it will give you a better idea of how much you need to know how much money you need to raise for your campaign, right? So you're not going to know what the production costs are 100% until you start going through that full DFM process before you launch your campaign. So extremely important, and this is something that I see a lot of times with clients approaching me when they've launched their campaign or they're just about to launch their campaign and they don't have like a solid factory lined up, they don't have a reliable prototype, and inevitably they end up delaying their deliveries. Point number 2, overcomplicating your first product. So again, understand that this is the first time this product is being made, and I understand a lot of times people come up with amazing products and has amazing features. Going back to the coolest cooler point that I made earlier, it's the first time you're making this product, man. So like the idea that the coolest cooler had like 20 different functionalities and it looked awesome. But from a manufacturing standpoint, like each one of those functions, each one of those items in the cooler has to be molded. Each one of those parts is almost like creating its own product. And doing it on the first version on a mass scale, it's a recipe for disaster. Like there's going to be electrical issues, there's going to be molding issues, there's going to be so many different things. So my recommendation always is, if you have an idea of what your product is, and let's say it has multiple functions and that's the USP, unique selling point, in the process of doing your market research and talking to the potential backers, try to narrow down the most important functions of that product and then try to go with the MVP, like the minimum viable product, because it's also not just the difficulty of making the product, it's also the expenses involved. The more complicated your product is, the more functions it has, the more molds it requires, the more components it requires to be sourced, the more expensive it is going to be to make. So it's better to try to launch and sell your first version, and then on version 2 you can add a little bit more functionality. Also, you'll be more experienced in the manufacturing space. Your factory will be more familiar with the product. So just try to keep it as simple as possible. Try to keep the core functionality, the most important things that make that product unique and attractive to your backers. So this is another very important point, not allocating enough time for mass production and the issues that can pop up during a mass production. So going back to the first point that I made, like in the process of creating prototypes, you'll see, just even with making a prototype, how many issues. You might go through 3 to 4 to 5 different variations of your prototype before you get it close enough. And even then it might not be 100%, right? So just imagine that, but then times 10,000, right? If you have a crowdfunding campaign and you have 10,000 backers and you have to make that product as close as possible to, the perfect version of it 10 times over. And it's the first time that this product is being made. There's a good chance that there might be some mistakes made during the production process, and there's unknown unknowns. Like there's things that even the factories won't be able to tell until they start making it on a mass scale. You have to allocate enough time, not just for mass production, but for the potential mistakes and the inspections and the the negotiation with the factory when it comes to if you do find issues in the production, and then you have to go back and forth and come up with solutions and see how you can fix that stuff. Like the molding, like molds take a long time to create and then they have to be tested. So if your factory is telling you that the production is going to be 4 months, I'd say double that, say 8 months to your backers, just to be on the safe side, because you just never know. It's the first time that the product's being made, and I can tell you, even with the most basic products, there's still issues that pop up. So really try to make sure that you're allocating enough time for mass production. And not just the mass production, but the issues that can pop up during mass production. Last but not least, people don't have a big enough budget for their production. And it's not just the production, it's also if you want to work with professional partners that are going to help you with your manufacturing, you really have to price out everything. So when I say professional partners, I mean manufacturing consulting businesses like Sourcefine Asia, like my company. Also knowing that, like I said, if you're told that the production's 4 months or 5 months, it could end up being 8. During that time period, if you're working with a consulting business, if you were on like a 4 or 5 month contract and then it extends beyond that, will you still have the funds to keep that company on? If there are additional issues with the production and you need to bring on an engineer to help solve some of those issues, will you have the budget for that? If you have to do multiple inspections of the goods, will you be able to, maybe you budgeted for 1 or 2 inspections, will you be able to allocate more money for multiple inspections and obviously the travel costs involved with sending inspector to the facilities? Even figuring out where your factory is located, because if your factory is in the middle of nowhere, it's going to be more expensive for any consulting company to travel to. So like you have to really understand what's going on with your production and what's going on with your factory. Something I've said to people before is like when you talk to a factory, and usually most factories are not in major cities. Let's put it like that. They're either adjacent or they're close or they're a couple hours away from the major cities. They will use a major city in their name because that's just a common thing with businesses in China, but it's also just a way for people to recognize where they are, because obviously China is such a large country. So if a factory says Shenzhen, electronics company, for example, they might not actually be in Shenzhen. They might be like an hour outside of Shenzhen. A perfect example is Shanghai. Like there's so many factories that say Shanghai, blah, 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 but they're like 2 hours away from Shanghai. You really have to understand like where they're located, because it could be more expensive to travel there, especially if they're in a very remote area. Like I said, if you're hiring a consulting company, not just budgeting for what you think the production is going to be, but budgeting beyond that if things get delayed or things stretch out further. The manufacturing issues, maybe you have to go through multiple iterations of prototypes or golden samples. That could raise your production costs. Maybe during the time period between when you contacted the factory and you started working on the project and your crowdfunding campaign, raw material costs go up during that whole time period, and by the time you've raised your money and you're ready to start the campaign, the per unit cost is 10-15% more expensive than it was before. Maybe you launch a campaign and it's bigger than you thought it was going to be, and you have backers that are in remote areas, and now the shipping costs, if you want to ship to them express, is going to be more expensive or more difficult than you initially anticipated. Maybe there's some sort of natural disaster like COVID, which limits the factory staff, and you need to help hire more factory workers to speed up the production. Like there's so many different things that can happen. So you need to make sure that you understand how your product's going to be made. And if you go through the prototyping phase, if you go through the DFM phase with the factory, getting accurate costs on production is extremely important before you launch your campaign. And then also budgeting for ancillary services and partners that you might need. Whether it's, like I said, hiring factory workers, hiring a consulting company like myself, quality control, shipping, maybe hiring an engineer to help with solving some of the production issues. So yeah, I mean, it's really important. A lot of times people that I talk to or potential clients, they're very much focused on the campaign and they don't think about these things. It's important to really, really understand this stuff. Otherwise, you're going to end up in a coolest cooler type situation. Or worse, you just don't have enough money to finish your production. Like, can't even start your production, or your production stalls halfway through. So the 4 points that I made were focusing on marketing and not sourcing. That was an extremely important point. Don't overcomplicate your first product, first production, the first version. You need to allocate enough time for mass production, and not just mass production, but the potential issues that can pop up during mass production. And then the last one was not planning ahead and not allocating a big enough budget for your production, and not just the mass production again, but the services around the manufacturing. So yeah, those are 4 points on how to prepare for a crowdfunding launch from a sourcing and manufacturing perspective. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Like, comment, share, subscribe, and I will see you guys next week.
I've come too far to turn back, so win or win is my only choice. I release songs they think it's for them, it's a cry for help but they miss the point. What's mad is when I speak for them, I feel like I lose my voice. but I can't linger or dwell on things. Yesterday's God, it's been better since. Still outside and I'm settled in. Still more scared than I ever been. Still feel blessed like I never sinned.